12 elite guards, trained since birth, lost control of every weapon they held in under 4 seconds, and the one who took them away was the janitor. I remember the exact moment the report crossed my desk because at first I thought it was a joke, the kind recruits whisper about when they think command isn't listening, the kind of story that gets passed around to make long shifts feel shorter, but the file was real, stamped with clearance codes that don't get used for humor, and attached to it was my own authorization signature, which meant I had already approved the incident review and somehow still hadn't processed what it meant, and that is when I understood something was wrong, not with the report, but with us, because the Galactic Guard does not make mistakes like that. We are not built to. We are selected before we can even form memories, trained before we understand fear, conditioned to respond faster than thought itself. Every movement calculated, every reflex refined over decades until reaction becomes instinct and instinct becomes law. And yet the footage showed something else entirely, something that didn't fit into any doctrine I had ever studied or enforced. It began like every other routine cycle: training rotations, weapons calibration, recruits running drills measured down to fractions of a second, the kind of precision that separates us from every other force in the galaxy. And in the background, almost invisible, there he was, pushing a maintenance cart across the polished floor like he had done 1,000 times before. A human, average height, maybe 5'10", wearing a standard utility uniform that blended into the environment so perfectly that most of my guards didn't even register his presence. And that was the first mistake, not noticing him, not because he tried to hide, but because we decided he wasn't worth noticing. I watched the early footage again and again, searching for the moment where something gave him away, some sign, some irregularity, but there was nothing obvious, no tension in his posture, no hesitation in his movement, just a steady rhythm: mop, step, rinse, repeat, like he belonged to the floor more than the room. Like his entire existence was built around cleaning up after those who mattered. And maybe that's why no one questioned it when one of the guards nudged a weapon crate out of place, and it slid across the floor, stopping just short of the human's path. Because in our minds, the hierarchy was clear: guards command, others comply, but the human didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. He simply adjusted his path by a few inches, nudged the crate back into position with the side of his foot, and kept moving, efficient, precise, almost practiced. And that was the second mistake, ignoring that kind of precision. Because precision without training is rare, and precision without acknowledgement is dangerous. I paused the footage at that moment more times than I can count, zooming in on details most would miss: the angle of his step, the timing of his movement relative to the guard's reaction. It was too clean, too exact, like he had already mapped the space before the crate ever moved, and still, no one reacted. Because why would they? He was a janitor, a background function, a non-threat. And that belief held strong right up until the moment everything changed, right up until the guards decided to turn routine into entertainment. Because arrogance always looks harmless until it isn't. And when I finally let the footage play forward again, I realized something that no amount of training had prepared us for. The problem was never that the human was in the room. The problem was that we had spent our entire lives learning how to fight enemies who wanted to be seen, and we had no idea what to do with one who didn't. By the time I reached the midpoint of the recording, I had already reviewed the credentials of every guard present in that room, and there were no weak links, no inexperienced recruits, no anomalies in their training records. Each one had passed every evaluation we have: reaction drills measured in milliseconds, decision-making under pressure, adaptive combat scenarios that simulate environments most species would not survive for 10 seconds. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the standard by which all others are judged, and that is why what happened next could not be explained by error, because error requires uncertainty, and our guards are not uncertain. They are precise, predictable in the best possible way, which is exactly why the human should have been irrelevant. I slowed the footage again as the guards began to notice him, not because he did anything dramatic, but because one of them, a veteran named Corin Hale, decided to turn routine into demonstration. He stepped into the human's path, not aggressively, not even intentionally hostile, just the kind of casual obstruction that comes from knowing you will not be challenged. His stance was relaxed, weight balanced, hands near his sidearm in the way all of our guards are trained, not to draw, but to remind others that they could, and the human stopped, not abruptly, not startled, just a smooth halt, like he had anticipated the exact point where the path would close. And for a moment nothing happened. No words, no reaction, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have, because pauses are where decisions are made, and decisions are where outcomes begin to shift. I watched Corin tilt his head slightly, a subtle gesture, but one that meant curiosity, not concern, because to him, the human was still nothing more than a maintenance worker who had wandered too close to something important. And then he spoke, not loud, not commanding, just enough to establish hierarchy, telling the human to step aside, to clear the path, to move along, the kind of instruction that does not require compliance, because it assumes it, and the human responded in a way that did not match the expectation, not with defiance, not with submission, but with something far more unsettling. He acknowledged the request with a small nod, adjusted his grip on the handle of his cleaning tool, and shifted his stance by less than an inch, and that was it. No apology, no urgency, no visible change in breathing or posture, just a minimal adjustment that somehow felt intentional, like every movement had already been calculated before the interaction even began. And that was when the second guard joined in. Then a third, not because they felt threatened, but because they were entertained, because nothing breaks routine faster than something unexpected, and a human who does not behave like a background element is unexpected. Their voices overlapped, light, almost amused, suggesting the human demonstrate something, asking if he understood the equipment around him, inviting him into a situation he was never meant to be part of. And still, the human did not react the way anyone predicted. He did not step back, did not step forward. He simply remained where he was, centered, balanced, present. And I realized something in that moment that I had missed before. The guards thought they were controlling the interaction, but control is not about who speaks or who stands in front. Control is about who dictates the pace. And from the very beginning, the pace had belonged to the human, slow, steady, deliberate, and completely outside the rhythm we had trained our entire lives to recognize. And that is why none of them saw what was coming, because they were looking for resistance. And what they got instead was something far more dangerous: cooperation without surrender. The room did not react the way it should have. There was no alarm, no immediate escalation, no call for reinforcement, because confusion does not trigger protocol. And what filled that space was not fear, it was hesitation, the kind that settles in when certainty collapses, but pride has not caught up yet. I watched Corin Hale take a half step back, not enough to concede ground, just enough to recalibrate. His eyes locked on the human in a way I had never seen before, not with dominance, but with calculation, as if he was trying to solve something that did not follow the rules he had spent his entire life mastering. And around him the others mirrored that shift, 12 elite guards standing in perfect formation, and yet none of them moved forward, because moving forward requires understanding what you are moving into. And for the first time, they did not have that understanding. The human, Ethan Cole, did not capitalize on the moment, did not advance, did not press any advantage. He simply lowered the practice weapon with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning, and placed it back onto the crate as if returning a misplaced tool, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, his focus already shifting away from them. And that was the part that unsettled me the most, not what he had done, but what he chose not to do, because restraint at that level is not instinct, it is discipline, and discipline like that does not come from nowhere. Corin finally spoke again, but the tone had changed, the casual authority replaced by something quieter, more deliberate, asking the human where he had learned to move like that, not demanding, not commanding, just asking. And the human responded with the same minimal clarity he had shown before, saying that he learned where he had to. No elaboration, no explanation, just a statement that offered nothing and yet said everything. Because there are only certain kinds of places where learning is not optional, where adaptation is not a skill but a requirement for survival. And I felt a slow realization settle in, heavy and unavoidable. We had assumed that training defined capability, that structure created superiority, that repetition built perfection. But what we were seeing did not come from structured repetition. It came from something else entirely, something less predictable and far more efficient. The guards began to reset, small adjustments in stance, subtle shifts in position, trying to re-establish the framework they understood, but the framework no longer fit because it had been built on the assumption that all participants played by the same rules, and Ethan Cole clearly did not. I replayed the sequence again, this time not focusing on the guards, but on him, analyzing every movement, every pause, every transition, and what I saw was not randomness. It was consistency, a pattern so refined it appeared invisible, no wasted motion, no excess energy, every action serving a single purpose and nothing more. And that is when I understood the true problem. We had mistaken complexity for superiority. We had layered our training with protocols and variations and contingencies until it became a system that required constant input to function. But the human operated on something simpler, something direct, something that did not need adjustment because it did not rely on expectation. And that is why he could move through them without resistance, because resistance requires opposition, and he never offered any. By the time the guards stepped back fully, giving him space without being told to, the outcome had already been decided, not in that moment, but long before, in every quiet repetition we had ignored, in every subtle movement we had dismissed. And as Ethan Cole picked up his cart and resumed his path across the floor, leaving behind a group of elite soldiers who no longer looked certain of anything, I realized that what we had witnessed was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration, and the most dangerous part was that it had not been intended for us at all. By the time the human reached the far end of the training floor, the room had not recovered, not because of what had been done, but because no one could agree on what they had just seen, and uncertainty spreads faster than any command. I watched the guards remain in position longer than protocol allowed, their formation intact but their focus fractured, each one replaying the interaction in their own mind, searching for the point where control was lost, and finding nothing, because there was no single moment where the situation shifted. It had been wrong from the beginning, and we simply did not notice. Corin Hale finally broke formation, not with the sharp precision of command, but with a slower, more deliberate step, his eyes still tracking the human as he resumed his work. And that was the detail that changed everything for me, because attention is a resource we do not waste. And yet now all of it was focused on someone who, minutes earlier, did not exist in our operational awareness. The other guards followed, not out of obedience, but out of instinct, drawn to something they could not categorize. And that is when the questions began, quiet at first, then overlapping, asking what that was, how he did it, whether it had been recorded, whether command would review it. And I realized they were not asking for answers. They were asking for confirmation that what they believed about themselves was still intact, and I did not have that confirmation to give. I shifted the footage again, isolating Ethan Cole as he moved through the corridor beyond the training zone. And what I saw there was even more unsettling than what had happened in the room, because nothing had changed. His pace remained steady, his movements consistent, his attention focused on the same routine tasks, wiping surfaces, aligning tools, restoring order to spaces others disrupted, as if the interaction had no significance at all. And that is when the final piece began to fall into place. Because individuals who perform at that level do not compartmentalize. They do not switch between states of capability. They operate from a baseline that does not fluctuate, which meant what we saw was not an exception. It was as normal. And that raised a question I could not ignore. How many times had we seen this and dismissed it? How many subtle adjustments? How many precise movements? How many indicators of control had we written off as coincidence simply because they came from someone we had already decided was irrelevant? I pulled up additional logs, maintenance schedules, security feeds from previous cycles, and the pattern was there, consistent, repeatable, hidden in plain sight. Small corrections to equipment placement that prevented larger disruptions, path adjustments that avoided collisions before they happened, interactions with other personnel that never escalated because they were resolved before tension formed. It was not dramatic, it was not obvious, but it was everywhere. And that is when I understood the scale of the oversight. We had not encountered something new. We had been surrounded by it, observing it, benefiting from it, without ever recognizing it. Because recognition requires expectation, and we had never expected anything from him. Back in the training room, the guards had finally dispersed, but not in the way they normally would. Their movements lacked the usual confidence. The sharp edges of certainty softened into something else, something quieter and far more dangerous: doubt. Because once doubt enters a system built on absolute confidence, it does not leave. It grows, it questions, it rewrites. And as I closed the report for the third time, I realized that what had happened was not a breach, not a failure, not even a challenge. It was a correction, a demonstration that our understanding of strength was incomplete. And the most concerning part was not that a single human could do what we had witnessed, it was the possibility that he was not unique at all. Once the initial report was archived, I did something I had not done in over a decade of command. I requested direct observation instead of relying on filtered summaries, because data can be interpreted, but presence cannot be ignored. And if there was even a possibility that what I had seen was incomplete, I needed to verify it myself. The next cycle, I positioned myself in the upper observation deck overlooking the same training floor, not as a commander, not as an authority figure, but as a witness, and I waited. The guards below resumed their routines with mechanical precision, drills executed exactly as prescribed, movements sharp, controlled, predictable. And yet something had changed, subtle, but measurable. Their spacing was wider, their reactions slightly delayed, not from lack of skill, but from hesitation, because once a system has been disrupted, it does not return to its original state without adjustment. An adjustment requires time, and during that time, uncertainty lives in every motion. I scanned the perimeter, not for threats, but for anomalies, and it did not take long to find him. Ethan Cole entered the training area from the same corridor as before, pushing the same maintenance cart, moving at the same steady pace. And if I had not known what I was looking for, I might have missed him again, because nothing about his presence demanded attention, and that was the point. His existence in that space was defined by absence, absence of threat, absence of importance, absence of expectation, and yet I had already seen what existed beneath that absence, and that knowledge changed everything. I watched as he began his routine, cleaning surfaces, aligning equipment, restoring order to the environment, and what struck me immediately was the efficiency, not just in execution, but in anticipation. He moved toward areas that had not yet been disrupted, correcting minor inconsistencies before they developed into larger issues, adjusting the position of a training unit by less than an inch to maintain alignment, clearing a path seconds before a guard moved through it, and none of it drew attention, because it was seamless, integrated into the flow of the environment in a way that felt natural, inevitable, like the space itself was correcting its own imperfections. And that was when I understood something critical. He was not reacting to the environment. He was shaping it, subtly, continuously, without ever being recognized as the source of that influence. One of the guards, not Corin this time, but another veteran, approached the edge of the cleaning zone, his posture confident, his movements deliberate, and I watched closely. Not for confrontation, but for interaction. The guard paused, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes shifting toward the human. And in that moment, I saw the hesitation, the memory of the previous cycle still present, still unresolved, and that hesitation altered his behavior. He adjusted his path slightly, avoiding the human instead of expecting the human to yield, and that was the first visible shift in hierarchy I had ever witnessed in that facility. Not commanded, not enforced, but chosen. And the human did not acknowledge it, did not react, did not even look up. He simply continued his task as if nothing had changed, and that lack of acknowledgement reinforced the shift more than any display of dominance ever could, because dominance that is not recognized is still dominance. But it is something else as well. It is control at a level that does not require validation. And as I continued to observe, the pattern repeated, small adjustments from the guards, subtle avoidance, increased awareness, and all of it centered around a single individual who did nothing to demand it. And that is when the final realization settled into place, heavy and undeniable. We had built an entire system around visible strength, measurable skill, and controlled outcomes, but the most effective presence in that system operated without any of those markers, and because of that, we had never accounted for it. And now that we had seen it, we could not unsee it, and that meant everything we believed about control, about authority, about what it means to be prepared, would have to be reevaluated from the ground up. By the third observation cycle, the shift was no longer subtle. It was structural. not in the rules themselves, but in how those rules were being applied. And that distinction mattered more than anything we had trained for, because doctrine only holds power when it is followed without hesitation, and hesitation had begun to appear everywhere, not as fear, not as weakness, but as recalculation. And recalculation slows systems that were designed for immediate response. I watched as the guards initiated a coordinated drill, a multi-angle engagement scenario that requires absolute synchronization, every movement timed to the millisecond, every position aligned with the others to create a seamless pattern of control. And for the first time since I had taken command, the pattern broke. Not completely, not enough to trigger failure, but enough to be visible. One guard adjusted too early, another compensated too late, and the flow fractured for less than a second before correcting itself. But that second mattered, because in our system, perfection is not the goal, it is the baseline, and anything less than that is deviation. I shifted my focus to the perimeter again, and there he was, Ethan Cole, moving through the same routine, the same quiet efficiency, but now the environment around him was different. The guards were aware, not overtly, not in a way that could be measured in standard metrics, but in the way their attention drifted toward him without intent, in the way their movements accounted for his presence even when he was not directly involved. And that was when I understood the true extent of the disruption. It was not that he had altered their capability, it was that he had altered their awareness, and awareness changes everything. Because once you are aware of something you cannot predict, every decision carries an additional variable, and additional variables slow response time, and slowed response time creates vulnerability, even in systems that are otherwise flawless. One of the senior instructors approached the center of the floor, calling for a reset, his voice steady, his authority intact. But I could hear the difference, a slight tightening, a controlled precision that suggested he was compensating for something he could not fully define. He addressed the guards, reminding them of their training, their discipline, their purpose, reinforcing the structure that had always guided them. And for a moment, it worked. Their posture sharpened, their movements aligned. The system reasserted itself, and then Ethan moved, not toward them, not into the drill, just across the edge of the training zone, pushing his cart along a path that intersected with their formation by less than a foot. And the reaction was immediate, not dramatic, not even conscious. But every guard in that formation adjusted, micro shifts in stance, slight changes in timing, enough to maintain distance, enough to avoid contact. And in doing so, they broke formation again, not because they had to, but because they chose to, and that choice was everything, because it proved that the hierarchy had shifted without command, without acknowledgement, without any formal change in authority. The human had not issued an order, had not demonstrated power in that moment, had not even looked at them, and yet they made space for him. I reviewed the footage again, isolating that sequence, analyzing the timing, the angles, the responses, and what I found was consistent across every instance. The guards were no longer operating purely on training. They were incorporating him into their decision-making process, and that meant he had become a factor, an unregistered, undefined variable that influenced behavior without being recognized as influence. And that is when the implications became clear, because in any system, the most dangerous variable is the one you do not formally acknowledge, the one that exists outside of your models, outside of your predictions, outside of your control. And as I watched Ethan Cole continue his routine, unchanged, unaffected, moving through a space that was quietly adjusting itself around him, I realized that we had not just encountered a new kind of capability, we had encountered a new kind of presence, one that does not dominate through force or command, but through inevitability. And once something becomes inevitable, resisting it is no longer an option, it is simply a delay. By the fourth cycle of observation, I stopped looking for confirmation and started looking for origin, because what we were seeing was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a pattern with roots, and patterns do not exist without cause. I accessed deeper personnel records, not the standard assignment logs, but the archived intake files that most commanders never bother to review once a role has been assigned. And that is where I found the first inconsistency. Ethan Cole was listed as maintenance staff, assigned to facility sanitation and equipment alignment, clearance level minimal, no combat designation, no advanced training markers, nothing that would justify the level of capability we had witnessed. And yet his transfer history did not align with that profile. Prior assignments included high-risk environments, remote stations with failure rates above acceptable thresholds, locations where systems break down faster than they can be repaired, where routine is a luxury and adaptation is the only constant. And that was when the context shifted, because training builds response, but environment builds necessity, and necessity creates efficiency that training cannot replicate. I returned to the live feed just as Ethan entered a secondary corridor adjacent to the main training floor, a narrower space, less populated, used primarily for equipment transport and system access. And for the first time, I saw him pause, not in response to a person, but to the environment itself. His gaze moved across the corridor, not scanning in the way our guards are trained to scan for threats, but assessing, measuring, identifying variables that most would ignore: a loose panel, a misaligned support bracket, a slight delay in the automated door cycle. And within seconds, he adjusted all of it, not with tools, not with formal procedure, but with small, precise movements that restored function without drawing attention. And that was when I understood something that had been present from the beginning but had gone unrecognized. His role was not maintenance, it was correction. He did not clean because the space was dirty. He cleaned because disorder existed, and disorder, no matter how small, was something he did not allow to remain. Back on the main floor, the guards continued their drills, but the influence persisted, their formations subtly adapting to his presence even when he was no longer in direct proximity, their timing adjusting to account for variables they could not define. And that is when the instructor made a decision that confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. He halted the drill entirely, not due to failure, but due to inconsistency, citing deviation from optimal performance thresholds. And while his words remained within protocol, the cause of that deviation was not something he could formally state, because it did not exist within the parameters of our system. You cannot report what you cannot classify, and Ethan Cole was not classified as anything relevant to their performance, and yet he was affecting it. I isolated the timeline again, mapping his movements against the fluctuations in guard performance, and the correlation was exact, not because he interfered, but because he existed within the same space, and that existence alone altered outcomes. And that is when the realization reached its final form. We had spent generations refining a system that assumes control comes from visibility, from measurable action, from defined roles and recognized authority, but what we were facing did not operate within those boundaries. It operated beneath them, within the margins, within the spaces we do not monitor because we do not believe anything significant happens there. And that belief had allowed this to go unnoticed for far too long. As Ethan resumed his path, moving back toward the main corridor, his cart rolling with the same steady rhythm, I understood that what we had witnessed was not the peak of his capability. It was the baseline, and baselines are what define limits, which meant our understanding of limits was incomplete. And if that was true for one individual, then the question was no longer how he did it, but how many others like him existed, moving through our systems, correcting what we do not see, influencing what we do not measure, and reshaping outcomes without ever being acknowledged as the cause. By the time I compiled the extended correlation map, the conclusion was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, repeatable, and impossible to dismiss. Every deviation in guard performance, every micro delay in execution, every subtle shift in spatial awareness aligned precisely with the proximity and movement of a single individual who officially held no operational relevance. And that contradiction was the most dangerous variable I had ever encountered, because systems do not fail from what they recognize, they fail from what they ignore. I expanded the observation window beyond the training facility, pulling feeds from adjacent sectors, logistics corridors, equipment bays, and support zones, and the pattern persisted, not as disruption, but as optimization, small inefficiencies corrected before they accumulated, potential conflicts avoided before they formed. Environmental variables stabilized without triggering maintenance protocols, and at the center of it all, moving without urgency, without recognition, was Ethan Cole, not as an anomaly, but as a constant. And that is when I understood the scope of what we were dealing with. He was not operating within our system, he was operating across it, influencing multiple layers simultaneously without ever intersecting them in a way that would trigger classification. I initiated a controlled test, not an engagement, not a confrontation, but a variable insertion, adjusting a section of the training floor by a margin small enough to pass standard tolerance checks, but large enough to create a measurable inconsistency in guard movement, a misalignment of less than half an inch across a 20-foot span, the kind of deviation that would not be corrected immediately, but would gradually impact performance over time. And then I waited. The guards began their drills. Their movements precise as always, but within seconds, I saw the shift, minor corrections, slight adjustments, compensations that maintained function but reduced efficiency, exactly as predicted. And then Ethan entered the space, not directed, not summoned, simply following his routine, and as he moved along the perimeter, his gaze passed over the altered section, and he paused, not for long, just enough to register the inconsistency, and without drawing attention, without interrupting the flow of activity, he made a single adjustment, a slight repositioning of a floor anchor, a correction so minimal it would not appear in standard logs, and the effect was immediate. The guards' movements realigned, their timing restored, the system returned to optimal function as if the deviation had never existed. And that was the moment the hypothesis became fact. He was not just influencing behavior. He was maintaining system integrity at a level we had never accounted for, not through authority, not through instruction, but through direct interaction with the variables themselves. And the implications of that realization extended far beyond a single facility. Because if one individual could operate at that level without recognition, then our entire model of operational awareness was incomplete. I reviewed his file again, this time not for what was present, but for what was missing. No recorded advanced training, no specialized designation, no formal acknowledgement of the capabilities we had observed, and that absence was not an oversight. It was a pattern, because records are designed to capture what systems value, and our system did not value what he represented, which meant it did not record it. And what is not recorded does not exist within the system's understanding, and what does not exist cannot be prepared for. I returned to the live feed one final time, watching as Ethan Cole continued his work, unchanged, unacknowledged, moving through a facility that had begun to unconsciously adapt to his presence. And I realized that the most critical question was no longer how he did what he did, but why he was here at all, because individuals like that are not assigned randomly. They are placed, and placement implies intent. And if there was intent behind his presence, then the possibility that we were observing only a fraction of a much larger structure was no longer speculation. It was probability, and that probability was something I could not ignore. Once the possibility of intent entered the equation, observation alone was no longer sufficient, because intent changes behavior when it is acknowledged, and I needed to determine whether Ethan Cole would react to direct attention or continue operating as if nothing had changed. So I initiated a controlled presence, not an order, not a confrontation, but a simple deviation from routine. I descended from the observation deck and entered the main training floor during an active cycle, something I rarely do without formal announcement, and the effect was immediate. The guards straightened, their movements sharpened, their awareness redirected toward me, because authority demands recognition, and recognition reshapes the environment. And that was exactly what I wanted to contrast. I moved through the formation slowly, observing their reactions, noting the precision, the discipline, the expected patterns of response. And then I shifted my attention, not to them, but to the far edge of the floor, where Ethan continued his work, unchanged, unaffected by my presence in a way that no one else in that room could replicate. And that alone confirmed the first part of my hypothesis. He did not operate within our hierarchy because he did not acknowledge it as a defining structure. I approached him directly, not aggressively, not with the posture of command, but with intent clear enough to register. And for the first time since this began, he looked up before I spoke, not in surprise, not in reaction, but in anticipation, as if he had already accounted for the possibility of this interaction and simply waited for it to occur. And that was when I understood the second layer of the problem. He was not just aware of the environment. He was aware of the patterns within it, including mine. I asked him a simple question, not about the incident, not about his actions, but about his role, asking how long he had been assigned to this facility, and his response was immediate, precise, and completely unremarkable on the surface. He gave a duration, a number of cycles that matched his official record, But what mattered was not the answer, it was the delivery, calm, neutral, without any attempt to expand or clarify. Exactly what someone in his position should say, and yet it felt incomplete. Not because he was withholding information, but because he was operating within a boundary that I could not define. I adjusted my approach, shifting the question slightly, asking whether he had observed any irregularities in the facility operations, and for the first time, there was a pause, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but evaluation, and then he responded, not with specifics, not with reports or data, but with a statement that reframed the entire concept. He said that irregularities are only visible when you are not part of them, and then he returned to his task, ending the interaction. Without dismissal, without acknowledgement, simply by continuing. And that was the moment everything aligned, because his answer was not about the facility, it was about perspective, about the difference between observing a system and existing within it. And we had spent our entire existence doing the former, analyzing, categorizing, controlling from a position of separation, while he operated within the system itself, adjusting it from the inside, without ever stepping outside of his role. I stepped back, not because the interaction was over, but because there was nothing more to extract through direct questioning, and I realized that the only way to understand what he was doing was to change how we observed, not by increasing scrutiny, but by removing assumptions, by accepting that the most critical variables may not present themselves as important, may not align with our definitions of strength or capability. And as I watched Ethan Cole move past me, pushing his cart along the same steady path, I understood that the true limitation was not in our training, not in our systems, but in our perception, and perception, once challenged, does not return to its original state. It expands, it adapts, and in doing so, it reveals everything that was always there but never seen. And that realization was more disruptive than any single action he could have taken. After that exchange, I stopped trying to define Ethan Cole within our existing categories because every attempt to label him reduced the accuracy of what I was observing, and instead I shifted to something far less comfortable. I began removing variables from our system to see what would remain unchanged, because what remains unchanged is what truly matters. I authorized a temporary reduction in automated support across a controlled section of the facility. Nothing critical, nothing that would trigger alarms, just enough to introduce friction into processes that normally ran without interruption, doors delayed by a fraction of a second, lighting cycles slightly desynchronized, environmental controls operating at the edge of acceptable variance, the kind of imperfections that accumulate quietly until performance begins to degrade. And then I waited. The guards responded as expected at first. Minor adjustments, small compensations, their training allowing them to maintain operational standards despite the inconsistencies. But as time passed, the accumulation began to show. Timing slipped by milliseconds, coordination required more conscious effort. The system held, but it was no longer effortless. And that distinction is where failure begins. I tracked Ethan's movement through that same section, noting that his path did not change, his pace did not increase, his behavior did not shift in any visible way. And yet as he moved through each affected area, the inconsistencies disappeared, not immediately, not in a way that would draw attention, but sequentially, efficiently, as if the environment itself was correcting behind him. A door cycle realigned just after he passed through. Lighting stabilized moments after he adjusted a panel by less than an inch. Airflow normalized after a brief pause near a control unit that did not even register his interaction in the system logs. And that was when I understood the scale of what he was doing. He was not responding to problems, he was preventing them from existing long enough to be recognized. I overlaid his movement with system diagnostics, and the correlation was absolute. Every correction aligned with his presence, every restored function followed his path, and still, there was no formal record, no logged intervention, no acknowledgement within the system itself that anything had occurred, which meant from the system's perspective, nothing had changed. Everything remained within acceptable parameters, and that illusion of stability was maintained entirely by someone the system did not recognize as relevant. Back on the training floor, the guards began to feel the difference without understanding the cause. Their movements regained sharpness, their timing realigned. The friction that had been introduced quietly disappeared, and with it, their awareness of the disruption, because when a system returns to normal, it does not question how it got there. It simply continues, and that is why his presence remained invisible, not because it could not be seen, but because it removed the need to look. I realized then that what we had been calling training, discipline, and control were only part of the equation. They defined how we operated within stable conditions, but they did not account for how stability itself was maintained, and Ethan Cole was operating at that level, not as a participant in the system, but as a stabilizing force within it. And that role does not require recognition. It requires consistency, precision, and an understanding of variables that most would never consider important. I reviewed his earlier statement again, the one about irregularities only being visible when you are not part of them, and now it made complete sense, because he was part of the system in a way we were not. We interacted with it, controlled it, imposed structure upon it, but he existed within it, adjusting it from the inside, without ever stepping outside of his role, and that difference was everything. Because control from the outside can be challenged, disrupted, even overridden, but control from within is seamless, continuous, and nearly impossible to isolate. As I concluded the observation, one final realization settled into place, quiet but undeniable. We had built our entire identity around being the most capable force in the galaxy, defined by our training, our precision, our ability to dominate any scenario. But none of that addressed the most fundamental requirement of any system, stability, and the one individual ensuring that stability operated beneath our awareness, without rank, without recognition, without even being considered part of the equation. And that meant the foundation of everything we believed about ourselves was incomplete, not because we were wrong, but because we had never considered what existed beyond our perspective. At that point, the final test was no longer about observation or inference. It was about confirmation, because everything I had seen suggested a conclusion that our entire command structure would reject without direct proof. So I designed a scenario that would remove all ambiguity, not by forcing a confrontation, but by creating a condition where inaction would lead to visible degradation. I authorized a temporary isolation protocol on a subsection of the facility, cutting off automated correction systems entirely while maintaining outward operational status. No alerts, no warnings, just a controlled decline hidden beneath the surface, the kind of situation where only direct intervention could restore balance. And then I waited. The guards entered the zone first, unaware of the change, their routines continuing as expected, but within minutes the inconsistencies began to accumulate. Equipment alignment drifting beyond acceptable margins, timing offsets compounding across synchronized drills, environmental responses lagging just enough to disrupt precision. And for the first time since I had taken command, the system did not self-correct, because I had removed the mechanisms that normally would. And that was the critical variable, because if my hypothesis was correct, there was one remaining factor that could still restore order. Ethan Cole entered the zone exactly 3 minutes into the degradation cycle, not summoned, not redirected, simply following the same path he had taken in every previous cycle, and I watched closely, not for reaction, but for decision, because this time the environment was not subtly imperfect, it was actively unstable, the kind of instability that trained personnel would immediately recognize as a problem requiring escalation. And yet the guards did not escalate, not because they lacked awareness, but because they had already begun to rely on something they could not define. Their movements slowed, their attention fractured, waiting without realizing they were waiting. And that is when Ethan paused, longer than before, his gaze moving across the space, taking in the misalignment, the timing errors, the structural inconsistencies, and for the first time, his routine broke pattern. He set aside his cart, not abruptly, not with urgency, just a deliberate shift in priority, and began to move through the zone with purpose, each step measured, each action precise. He adjusted a primary anchor point that had shifted beyond tolerance, realigned a control interface that governed timing synchronization, corrected a sequence delay in the environmental response system by accessing a panel most guards did not even know existed, and all of it was done without hesitation, without reference, without any visible process of analysis, as if the solution was already known before the problem had fully formed. And as he moved, the system responded, not gradually, But immediately, alignment restored, timing recalibrated, environmental stability reestablished, and within less than 60 seconds, the entire subsection returned to optimal performance, not through automated correction, not through command intervention, but through a series of direct, manual adjustments performed by someone who officially had no authority to make them. I reviewed the system logs in real time, and as expected, there was no record of intervention, no acknowledgement that anything had been corrected. From the system's perspective, stability had never been lost, and that was the final confirmation. He did not just operate within the system, he existed beneath its detection threshold, correcting it in ways that left no trace, and that meant the system itself depended on him without ever recognizing that dependency. The guards resumed their drills, their movements sharp once again, their confidence restored, and none of them questioned how the instability had resolved. Because resolution without awareness reinforces assumption, and assumption is the foundation of every system we build. I remained in observation, not because there was more to learn, but because I needed to process what had already been proven. And as Ethan Cole returned to his cart, resuming his routine as if nothing had occurred, I understood that the most significant capability we had ever encountered was not one that dominated, not one that displayed power, but one that ensured everything else could function as intended. And that capability, hidden beneath our awareness, operating without recognition, was not an anomaly. It was a necessity we had never accounted for, and that realization changed everything. In the cycles that followed, nothing officially changed, no new directives were issued, no revisions were made to doctrine, no acknowledgement was recorded in any formal system. And yet everything was different, because once a truth has been seen, even if it is not spoken, it reshapes every decision that comes after it. I watched as the guards continued their training, their movements as precise as ever, their discipline intact, their performance metrics returning to optimal ranges, and from an external perspective, the system appeared flawless, exactly as it was designed to be, but I could see the difference, not in what they did, but in how they did it. There was an awareness now, subtle but persistent, a recognition that something existed beyond their control, something that could not be measured, trained against, or predicted, and that awareness changed the way they moved through the space, not with fear, but with respect, not for a person, but for a possibility. Ethan Cole remained exactly the same, his routine unchanged, his presence as quiet and consistent as it had always been, moving through corridors, across training floors, through systems that continued to rely on him without ever acknowledging that reliance. And that was the part that stayed with me, not the moment he disarmed 12 elite guards, not the correction of system failures in seconds, not even the realization that he operated at a level we had never considered, but the fact that none of it required recognition, because what he represented was not performance, it was function, and function does not need to be seen to be essential. I reviewed every piece of data one final time, not searching for errors, but for confirmation. And what I found was consistency, absolute and undeniable. Every system that operated at peak efficiency intersected with his presence. Every environment that maintained stability did so within his range of influence. And yet there was no record, no designation, no acknowledgement that he was part of that equation. And that absence was no longer an oversight. It was intentional, because systems record what they are designed to value, and ours had never been designed to value something like him. And that is when the final realization settled into place, not as a question, but as a certainty. We had not been training to become the most capable force in the galaxy. We had been training to operate within a system that required something else to remain stable, something that did not compete, did not command, did not even identify itself as superior, but ensured that everything else could function at its highest level. And that meant the foundation of our strength was not what we had believed. It was something quieter, something constant, something we had never considered. Because it did not fit our definition of power, I stood on the observation deck one last time, watching as Ethan Cole moved across the floor below, his cart rolling with the same steady rhythm, his movements as precise and unremarkable as ever, and I understood what we had been missing, not just about him, but about humans as a whole. They do not need to dominate a system to control it. They do not need to announce their presence to define an outcome. They operate within the structure, beneath it, around it, shaping it in ways that leave no trace and require no acknowledgement. And that is why we never saw it, because we were looking for something that looked like us, something that followed the same rules, the same patterns, the same visible markers of strength. And what we found instead was something entirely different, something that does not break systems, does not challenge them directly, but makes them depend on its presence without ever realizing it. And as that understanding settled in, there was only one conclusion left to accept, not as a statement, but as a fact that would reshape everything we believed moving forward. We were never the highest level of control in this facility, we were the most visible, and visibility, I now understood, is not the same as power.